In the United States, if someone tells you they are liberal, they probably vote Democrat. In Argentina, they probably defend the free market. In Sweden, they are probably somewhere in between. And in Spain, the word changes meaning depending on who says it. It is possibly the most confusing word in the entire political vocabulary. And that is a problem, because liberalism is not a vague adjective. It is an intellectual tradition with nearly 400 years of history. A tradition that transformed the world. And one that remains the foundation, often invisible, of the societies most of us live in. Today we are going to meet the original liberalism. Before the word was corrupted. Before it became an insult or an empty compliment. In the previous episode we defined capitalism as an economic system. But capitalism did not emerge on its own. It needed a framework of ideas to sustain it. A philosophy that justified private property, that limited the power of the state, that placed the individual at the center. That philosophy is liberalism. And to understand it, we need to go back to the 17th century. To an England that had just cut off its king's head. 1689. William of Orange has just taken the English throne after the Glorious Revolution. The philosopher John Locke, who had been living in exile, publishes his 2 treatises of government. It is the birth certificate of political liberalism. Locke's central idea is revolutionary for his time, though it seems obvious to us today. Human beings are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. These rights are not granted by the king. They are not bestowed by the state. They exist before any government. Government, according to Locke, is a contract. Citizens agree to give up part of their freedom in exchange for the government protecting their rights. But if the government violates those rights, the contract is broken. And citizens have the right to resist. This was dynamite. In a Europe where kings ruled by divine right, Locke was saying that legitimate power comes from below, not from above. That government exists to serve the governed, not the other way around. Locke's influence was immense. The founding fathers of the United States cited him when they drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The idea that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights is, literally, Locke translated into American English. Adam Smith, whom we already know from Part 11, added the economic dimension to liberalism. In The Wealth of Nations, published the same year as the Declaration of Independence, Smith argued that economic freedom is not just a moral right. It is also a tool for prosperity. When individuals are free to produce, trade, and invest without excessive state interference, the result is more wealth for everyone. Not because individuals are generous, but because competition forces them to offer better products at better prices. But Smith was not a market fundamentalist. We already saw that. He supported state intervention in education, infrastructure, and defense. He believed the government should protect citizens against monopolies and abusive practices. Economic freedom, for Smith, was not the total absence of government. It was limited and well-directed government. Here a tension is born that liberalism will carry for centuries: how much government is too much government? And how little is too little? John Stuart Mill took liberalism a step further. In his essay on liberty, published in 1859, he formulated what we now know as the harm principle. Society only has the right to limit an individual's freedom when that person's conduct causes harm to others. As long as you harm no one, you are free to live as you wish, think what you wish, and say what you wish. It sounds simple. But consider how radical it was in Victorian England. Mill was defending freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of lifestyle, in a society where conformity was unwritten law. Mill also pushed liberalism in a direction that would make many later liberals uncomfortable. He argued that formal freedom is worthless without the material conditions to exercise it. Being free to choose means little if you are starving. This idea opened the door to what would later be called social liberalism, the notion that the state has a duty to guarantee minimum conditions so that freedom is real, not merely theoretical. Mill was also a pioneer in defending women's rights. In 1869 he published The Subjection of Women, arguing that the subordination of women was an obstacle to human progress. In a parliament of men, in a society of men, he was one of the first to state the obvious. By the late 19th century, liberalism had forked. And that fork explains much of today's confusion. On one side, classical liberalism held the original line: individual rights, minimal government, free markets, distrust of the state. This tradition survives today in European liberal parties, in part of orthodox economic thought, and in the libertarian tradition we will explore later. On the other side, social liberalism emerged. Thinkers like T.H. Green and Leonard Hobhouse in England, and later John Dewey in the United States, argued that real freedom requires material conditions. That a child who cannot go to school or a worker with no protection against illness is not truly free, no matter what the law says. This branch led to the welfare state, to universal public education, to public health care, to labor rights. Things that classical liberalism considered state interference, social liberalism considered necessary conditions for freedom. It is this branch that dominates the meaning of liberal in the United States, someone who defends civil rights and an active state in social policy. Exactly the opposite of what liberal means in many Latin American or European countries, where the word evokes free markets and minimal government. Neither branch has more right than the other to claim the heritage of Locke and Smith. Both start from the same principles. They simply disagree on what freedom needs to be real. Liberalism, in any of its variants, starts from a powerful intuition that the individual matters, that there are limits to what the state, the church, the community, or the majority can impose on you. In practice, liberal societies have a notable track record. Countries with strong liberal traditions tend to have more protection of human rights, more press freedom, more economic prosperity, and more political stability. It is no coincidence that the countries at the top of the Human Development Index are, almost without exception, liberal democracies. Liberalism also has a structural virtue, tolerance. By separating the public sphere from the private, it allows people with very different beliefs and values to coexist in the same society. You do not need to agree with me to live next to me. We just need to mutually respect each other's rights. But liberalism has serious critics from many directions. From the left, the main criticism is that liberalism protects formal freedom but ignores real inequality. There is little use in freedom of contract if a worker has no option but to accept miserable conditions because the alternative is hunger. Marx called liberal rights bourgeois freedoms, freedoms that only benefit those who already have the resources to exercise them. From communitarianism, the criticism is that liberalism atomizes society. By placing the individual at the center, it weakens community bonds, traditions, and collective identities. The human being is not an isolated atom. We are social beings who need belonging. From post-colonial thought, the criticism is that liberalism presented itself as universal but was born in a very specific context, the white, male, property-owning Europe of the 17th century. The very thinkers who defended individual freedom often justified slavery or colonialism. Locke invested in the slave trade. Mill worked for the British East India Company. The universality of liberalism, these critics say, was always selective. Freedom for some, subjugation for others. And from the traditionalist right, the criticism is that liberalism destabilizes the social order by eroding authority, religion, and natural hierarchy. That a society of individuals without strong bonds is a fragile society. Each of these criticisms has merit. None has managed to displace liberalism as the dominant framework, but all of them point to real cracks. For a concrete person, liberalism is the promise that no one can dictate how you live, what to believe, whom to associate with, what to say. It is an extraordinary promise. And in many parts of the world, a promise kept. But for a person without resources, liberalism can feel like an empty promise. The freedom to choose a school means nothing if you cannot afford any of them. The freedom to start a business means nothing if you have no capital. Freedom of expression means nothing if nobody listens. The tension between formal freedom and real freedom is the great unresolved question of liberalism. And the answer each society gives to that question determines what kind of liberalism it practices. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, liberalism is an intellectual tradition that places the individual at the center. It was born with Locke and natural rights, grew with Smith and economic freedom, and matured with Mill and the harm principle. Second, liberalism forked into 2 major branches. Classical liberalism defends minimal government and free markets. Social liberalism defends an active state that guarantees the material conditions of freedom. Both branches are legitimate heirs of the liberal tradition. Third, liberalism has produced the most prosperous and free societies in history. But it has real blind spots. It can protect formal freedom while ignoring material inequality, it can atomize communities, and it has historically coexisted with exclusions that contradicted its own principles. Liberalism promised freedom and prosperity. But as factories spread across Europe, a growing number of people were asking an uncomfortable question: freedom for whom, prosperity for whom? The answer was socialism. And it has many more faces than you might think. That, next time.